Japan, and what you had was an invasion that was to occur on November 1st, where literally 55,000 U.S. combatants, 550,000 U.S. combatants would face literally 2.5 million Japanese regulars. The reason this is so important is because throughout the Pacific campaigns, while the Americans were blitzing across the Pacific Islands, they had faced, in every single invasion, they had faced a Japanese force which was literally half their size or 1/3 of their size. The Americans, in every single invasion in the Pacific, had, up to this point, faced a Japanese force while they had 2 or 3 times, at least, the numerical advantage. For the first time in the war, the Americans were going to wind up facing Japanese that outnumbered them. And these were regulars. These are before the irregulars were moved in. Women and children who were mobilized to throw bombs or grenades behind the line. If all of that's somehow pathetic to you, we have to reflect back on Vietnam. And in order to make this seem important, people will argue that a guerrilla war or an insurgency cannot exist without an outside supplier to make it a debacle. Well, at that point, an American invasion of Japan would have been faced with literally a supplier in the form of a Japanese-dominated Asia. This gives us a strategic overview of the whole Pacific situation in 1945, which most Americans aren't aware of. All of the Americans had was a huge bombing capacity from these islands. They had invaded Okinawa specifically to launch the invasion. They had naval dominance. They had submarine interdiction. All of these huge pockets of Japanese soldiers or Marines were isolated on these islands, but the majority of Dutch East India was still connected to Japan via the Vietnam link. And this entire Chinese area, which would be Japanese dominated, would be supplying an insurgency on the Japanese home islands while the Americans invaded. To show you how serious this is, during the Vietnam War, U.S. aircraft from carriers, Thai bases, Guam, they were all striking deep into Vietnam, hundreds of miles, and into North Vietnam, specifically, the Republic of, as opposed to South Vietnam on air support missions. And cruisers and destroyers and full-flag battleships were using their artillery to bombard all the way deep into Laos and Cambodia. So this was a bombardment that was on the level of World War I or any pre-invasion of a Japanese island throughout the Vietnam War. Now, half the total combat missions that were flown into North Vietnam were flown by naval aircraft, and over 550 of them, literally over 500 carrier planes, were shot down. So these combat losses are equal to over 40 squadrons of carrier aircraft, and that was in the Vietnam War, and that's got to dwarf major carrier battles in the Pacific. So America would have all of these carriers, battleships, off the Japanese coast. They would be flying them in to an insurgency that would be supplied from China with millions of troops in reserve to just constantly feed into the grinder. Now, to show you how urgent that situation is, this is Japan's view of the war. This is how Japan remembers the war, or rather, how the Japanese were able to negotiate the peace. These are the reported, that's the operative word here, reported balloon bombing incidents in North America. To be reported means that these were the duds. These were the ones that fizzled. These were the ones that didn't go off, and people found them and reported them to various public safety services. As you can see, the wind blew them all the way into Michigan. What's so important about this is the wind blows only one way. The wind always blows from Asia. So Japan has a never-ending source of an airstream in which to carry these balloon bombs. Now, I saw the documents on the bombs that actually went off. So if you think these are the duds, we have to remember that the Japanese built mechanical contrivances to work. That's why so many Americans drive Japanese cars and trust the lives of their families and loved ones to them. The Japanese built literally thousands that went off. The entire West Coast, especially in the Pacific Northwest, was an inferno. And that was the reason that these balloon bombs were taken so seriously. Now, at the end of the war, what could be termed as rogue elements were basically the I-400 submarines. These were the Sentoku submarines, an I-400 class of submarines that were built as submarine aircraft carriers. Each one of them carried 3 seaplanes. And all of these, there was about 4 of them that were built, actually 5. So the way that they operated and the reason for their importance was because they were meant to operate extremely long distances at a strategic level. The entire submarine and naval arm up to that point had been sacrificed by Emperor Hirohito, but these were no longer operational vessels. They were strategic. They were always accompanied by a submarine fleet of around 30 vehicles, submarine vessels, that some of them would be devoted to water tending, some of them would be medical submarines, some of them would carry supplies, but in the end they were all to keep that submarine afloat at sea for months and months at a time, during which time it could always surface at the isolated garrisons of the Japanese armies that were portrayed on the other map, and then get the supplies they need to resubmerge again. Now, what made them so dangerous was, of course, the atomic bomb. The Japanese, in 1939, began to build cyclotrons. This is a Japanese cyclotron. And at the end of the war, the Americans were dismantling Japanese cyclotrons as part of the peace agreement, kind of what they would like to do with Iran. And this is actually a photograph of the American dismantling of a Japanese cyclotron in 1945, per the Emperor's agreement. But in terms of the atomic bombs, where they had been produced was in Korea, which had never been bombed by the Americans and was only cut off towards the end of the war by the Soviet invasion of Korea. So the Japanese had already produced enough bombs, and the reason that this is pertinent